came to the throne in 1837. She was just 18. She was to rule for almost 64 years, then gave a name to an age of economic and scientific progress and social reform. Her own sense of duty made that their ideal had of a constitutional monarchy. She remained apart from politics and yet provided stability. In 1840, she married Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. They had 9 children, and their family life provided a model of respectability. Prince Albert was a clever man, and Victoria relied more and more on his advice and help. In 1857, she gave him the title of Prince Consort in recognition of his importance to the country. The 1830s had seen the beginning of what was to be called an age of reform. The first Reform Act, 1832, also called the Great Reform Act, had transferred voting privilege from the small boroughs, controlled by the nobility and the gentry, to the large industrial towns like Birmingham and Manchester. The Factory Act, 1833, had prevented children aged 9 to 13 from being employed more than 48 hours a week, and no person between 13 and 18 could work more than 72 hours a week. The Poor Law Amendment Act had reformed the old poor laws dating from Elizabeth I, with the creation of workhouses, institution where the poor received board and lodging in return for work. Workhouses and religion. Life in the workhouses was appalling on account of their system of regimentation, hard work, and a monotonous diet. The poor had to wear uniforms and their families were split. This apparent hard line was due in part to an optimistic faith in progress and to the Puritan virtues of hard work, frugality, and duty. The idea behind workhouses was that awareness of such a dreadful life would inspire the poor to try to improve their own conditions. Workhouses were mainly run by the church. Religion was a strong force. In industrial areas, the nonconformist churches, such as Methodists, promote study and abstinence from alcohol. And then we had the birth of Chartism. In 1838, a group of working-class radicals drew up a People's Charter demanding equal electoral districts, universal male suffrage, a secret ballot, paid members of parliament, annually elected parliaments, and abolition of the property qualification for membership. No one in power was ready for such democracy, and the Chartist movement failed. However, their influence was later felt when, in 1867, the Second Reform Act enfranchised part of the urban male working class in England and Wales for the first time, and in 1872, the secret ballot was introduced with the Ballot Act. The Irish potato famine, bad weather, and an unknown plant disease from America caused the destruction of potato crops. In 1845, Ireland, whose agriculture depended on potatoes, experienced a terrible famine, during which a lot of people died, and many emigrated mostly to America in search of a better life. The Irish crisis forced the Prime Minister Cyril Peel to abolish the Corn Laws. In 1846, these laws imposed tariffs on imported corn, keeping the prices of bread artificially high to protect landed interests. In the mid-years of the 19th century, England experienced the second wave on industrialization, which brought economic, cultural, and architectural change. While European monarchies were topped by revolutions, in 1848, England avoided the revolutionary wave. In 1851, a great exhibition organized by Prince Albert showed the world's Britain's industrial and economic power. The exhibition was housed at the Crystal Palace, a huge structure of glass and steel designed by Sir Joseph Paxton, erected in Hyde Park. More than 15,000 exhibitors from all over the world displayed their goods to millions of visitors. People became very fond of exhibitions, so money was invested in setting up several museums. including the Natural History Museum, the Science Museum, and what is now called the Victoria and Albert Museum. Entrance was free. The building of the London Underground began in 1860, and railways started to transform the landscape and people's lives. They transported large quantities of raw materials and products quickly and cheaply. People were able to travel for work and leisure, and the middle classes could live in the suburbs instead of the crowded town centers. Steamships expanded the Victorian world even further. In the mid-19th century, England was involved in the two Opium Wars against China, which was trying to suppress the opium trade. The First Opium War was fought between China and Britain, while the Second Opium War, also known as the Anglo-French War in China, was fought by Britain and France against China. England gained access to 5 Chinese ports and control of Hong Kong. The most lucrative colony of the British Empire was India. In 1857, the widespread rebellion known as the Indian Mutiny against British rule began, after which the Indian administration was given fewer responsibilities. Britain also supported some liberal causes like Italian independence from the Austrians. When Russia became too powerful against the weak Turkish Empire, the Crimean War was fought. It began a dispute between Russia and the Ottoman Turks, but soon France and Britain got involved, since they wanted to limit Russia's power in the area. The Crimean War was the first conflict reported in newspapers by journalists on the ground. People were generally shocked by the reports. Florence Nightingale volunteered to lead a team of 38 nurses at Scutari Base Hospital during the war, and she became known as the Lady with the Lamp for her night rounds, giving personal care to the wounded. Once back in England, she formed an institution for the development of nursing profession to create the first group of nurses. The Victorian Age was marked by complexity. It was a time of unprecedented change, but also of great contradictions. Also referred to as the Victorian Compromise, it was an age in which progress, reforms, and political stability coexisted with poverty and injustice. Listening to sermons was a popular pastime, yet vices were openly indulged. Modernity was praised, but there was a revival of Gothic and classicism in art. Religion played an important role in people's lives. Evangelicalism, in particular, encouraged public and political action and created a lot of charities. Philanthropy led to the creation of societies which addressed every kind of poverty and depend especially on the voluntary efforts of middle-class women. The Victorians believed in God, but also in progress and science. Freedom was linked with religion as regarded freedom of conscience, with optimism over economic and political progress, and with national identity. Increasing emphasis was placed on education, and hygiene was encouraged to improve health care. Self-restraint, good manners, and self-help came to be linked with respectability, a concept shared both the middle and working classes. There was general agreement on the virtues of asserting a social status, keeping up appearances, and looking after a family. These things were respectable, so respectability is a key word. However, respectability was a mixture of morality and hypocrisy. Since the unpleasant aspects of society, dissolution, poverty, social unrest, were hidden under outward respectability, there was growing emphasis on the duty of man to respect and protect women, seen at the same time as physically weaker but morally superior. Divine guides and inspires of man. Women controlled the family budget and brought up the children. General attitudes to sex were a crucial aspect of respectability, with an intense concern for female chastity or custody. And single women with a child were marginalized as fallen women. Sexuality was generally repressed in both its public and private forms. Immoralizing prudery in its most extreme manifestations, gradually led to the denunciation of nudity in art, the veiling of sculptured genitals, and the rejection of words with a sexual connotation from everyday vocabulary. Victorian values found a basis in some of the movement of thought of the age. The religious movement known as the evangelicalism influenced Victorian emphasis upon moral conduct as a test of the good Christian. Inspired by the teachings of John Wesley, the founder with his brother of Methodism, the evangelicals believed in the literal truth of the Bible, obedience to a strict code of morality which opposed many forms of entertainment, and dedication to humanitarian causes and social reform. The other movement which exerted an important influence on 19th century social thinking was utilitarianism, based on Jeremy Bentham's principles. The origins of this movement can be traced back to the Greek philosopher Epicurus. According to utilitarianism, an action is morally right if it has consequences that led to happiness, and wrong if it brings about the reverse. Therefore, all institutions should be tested in the light of reason and common sense to determine whether they are useful, measuring the extent to which they provide for the material happiness of the greatest number of people. Utilitarianism suited the interest of the middle class and contributed to the Victorian conviction that any problem could be overcome through reason. The utilitarian indifference to human and cultural values was firmly attacked by many intellectuals of the time, including Charles Dickens and John Stuart Mill, a major figure in the British and Empiricist religion. Educated by his father according to the principles of Benthamite philosophy, Mill found them inadequate with regard to the rapid changes of this time, and restated his belief as follows. So, Mill maintained that happiness is a state of the mind and the spirit, not a mere search for selfish pleasures. He thought legislation should have a more positive function in trying to help men develop their natural talents and personalities. He conceived a good society as one where the free interplay of human character creates the greatest variety. He believed progress comes from mental energy, and therefore accorded great importance to education and art. He promoted a long series of reforms, including the causes of popular education, trade union organization, the development of cooperatives, the extension of representation to all citizens, and the emancipation of women. In the mid-Victorian age, new challenges came from the fields of geology, biology, archaeology, and astronomy. Geologists found fossils in rock and began to question the book of Genesis. The question was brought to the wide public by Sir Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology. That also Charles Darwin presented his theory of evolution and natural selection. He later developed in his work the descent of man and in selection in relation to sex. According to Darwin's theory, all living creatures in existence have developed from their forms through a slow process of change and adaptation in a struggle for survival. Favorable physical conditions determine the survival of a species, unfavorable ones its extinction. Man evolved like any other animal from a less highly organized form, namely a monkey. On the one hand, Darwin's theory discarded the version of creation given by the Bible. On the other hand, it seems to show that the universe was not static but perpetually developing, that the strongest survived and the weakest deserved to be defeated. And now let's see the Oxford movement. So British Catholics replied to the challenges of science by returning to the ancient doctrines and rituals. The religious revival found its expression in the movement headed by the English Cardinal John Henry Newman, which went under the name of Oxford Movement because it began at Oxford University in 19th century. The later years of Queen Victoria's reign, when Prince Albert tragically died from typhoid in 1861, Queen Victoria withdrew from society and spent the next 10 years in mourning. She still remained an important figure, even though the political panorama was changing with the regrouping of the parties. The Liberal Party, called as it was called from the 1860s, included the former Whigs, some radicals, and a large minority of businessmen, and was led by Gladstone, while the Conservative Party, which had evolved from the Tories, reaffirmed its position under the leadership of Benjamin Disraeli, who became Prime Minister in 1868. So the Prime Minister was from the Conservative Party, and regained the office. So Disraeli regained the office after the election in 1874. In his second term, his government passed an Artisans and Laborers Dwellings Act, which allowed local public authorities to clear the slums and provided housing for the poor. A Public Health Act, which provided sanitation as well as running water, and a Factory Act, which limited the working hours per week. Disraeli's foreign policy was dominated by the Eastern question, that is, the decay of the Ottoman Empire, and the attempt to buy other European countries such as Russia to gain power there. In 1875, Disraeli encouraged the purchase of more shares in the Suez Canal Company to protect Britain's route to this. Gladstone was Prime Minister 4 times, starting in 1868. At that time, reforming legislation focused on education. Elementary schools had long been organized by the church. The 1870 Education Act supported the national system by introducing board schools, mainly in the poorer areas of the towns. By 1880, elementary education had become compulsory. Other reforms included the legalization of trade unions, with the Trade Union Act and the introduction of the secret ballot at election in 1872 with the Ballot Act. Gladstone from the Liberal Party from the former Whigs was re-elected 3 times. The Third Reform Act extended voting to all male householders, including miners, mill workers, and farm laborers. This extension of the franchise gave public opinion an important role as a political force. The Irish Parliamentary Party, sitting as a group in Westminster and led by Charles Stuart Parnell, demanded self-government for Ireland, the so-called Home Rule. Gladstone believed that Home Rule was the way to bring peace to Ireland and tried to get Parliament to pass a bill 3 times, but an Irish government was granted only after World War I. Then, the struggle with France at the beginning of the 19th century had led to Britain's global hegemony, with its naval power, and its enormous financial and economic strength. Britain seemed invulnerable. However, since Waterloo, its foreign policy had been defensive. Many areas of the war were characterized by political and cultural fragmentation, and it was that Britain began to gain control without major political intervention. This was the situation in South America, in Asia, and most of all in Africa, where Britain competed with the other European countries to divide up the continent. In South Africa, by the 1870s, the British controlled 2 colonies, Cape Colony and Natal, while Dutch settlers, the Boers, had 2 republics of the Transvaal and the Orange Free State. When Britain took over Transvaal in 1877, the Boers rebelled and war broke out. The Boer Wars ended in 1902 with a British victory, but in 1877, Queen Victoria was given a new title, Empress of India. In the last decades of the 19th century, The British Empire occupied an area of 4 million square miles, and more than 400 million people were ruled over by the British. The empire, however, was becoming more difficult to control. There was a growing sense of the white man's burden, a difficult combination of the duty to spread Christian civilization, encouraging toleration and open communication, at the same time promoting commercial interests. It was a strongly felt obligation to provide leadership where states were failing or non-existent, especially in Africa and India. India was economically important as a market for British goods and strategically necessary to the British control of Asia, from the Persian Gulf to Shanghai. By 1850, the East India Company directly ruled most of northern, central, and southeastern India. In the late Victorian period, the new imperial government became more ambitious, and through free market economics, it destroyed traditional farming and caused the deindustrialization of India. At one time, the main manufacturer of cotton cloth for the world, India now became the largest importer of English cotton. But the Victorian age came to an end with the death of Queen Victoria in 1901. For almost a century, she had embodied decorum, stability, and continuity. The golden and diamond jubilees for 50 and 60 years of the throne had been celebrated with huge public parades, and for her funeral, London streets were packed with mourners. She was buried beside her beloved husband in the Frogmore Mausoleum at Windsor Castle. In the later years of Victoria's reign, Britain was an urban society. Victorian cities had gas-lighting rubbish collection, and there were many public buildings such as town halls, railway stations, libraries and museums, music halls, boarding schools and hospitals, or police stations and prisons. This was a period of retail consumer boom, with many new shops, public houses and theaters. Even now, some Victorian institutions can be still seen in British cities. Middle-class women became increasingly involved in public life as leaders in campaigns against prostitution, as teachers, and as volunteer charitable workers. Further education opportunities for women became available with the opening of women's colleges in the 1870s. However, a strong taboo remained regarding family issues such as the control over property, conditions of divorce and rights over children, as well as question of sex and childbirth. The Married Women's Property Act in 1882 gave married women the right to own and manage their own property independently of their husband for the first time. Darwin's theory of evolution became the foundation for various ethical and social systems such as social Darwinism, which developed in the 1870s. The philosopher Herbert Spencer applied Darwin's theory of natural selection to human society. He held that races, nations, and social classes, like biological species, were subject to the principle of the survival of the fittest, and that the poor and oppressed did not deserve compassion. Eugenics was a similar interpretation created by Darwin's cousin Sir Francis Galton, and attracted many intellectuals. They exhort the middle classes, regarded as the nation's fittest, to reproduce more, especially educated women who seemed to neglect their racial duty to breed. In the second half of the 19th century, Britain reached the peak of its power abroad. However, some ideological conflicts were beginning to undermine the self-confident attitude that had characterized the first part of Victoria's reign. Changes regarded several fields, especially scientific achievements, industrialization, sexuality, and religion, and a growing pessimism began to affect intellectuals and artists, who expressed in different ways the sense of doubt about the stability of Victorian society. Among the thinkers of the late Victorian period, a significant role was played by those who protested against the harm caused by industrialism, immense life, and in the environment. Karl Marx based theories he expressed in his treatise in 3 volumes, Das Kapital. Upon research done in England, the most advanced European industrial nation of the time. His works influenced some English writers like the art critic John Ruskin and the artist William Morris. They were looking for different forms of progress, a blend of utopianism and nostalgia, in which their future in many ways resembled the past. By studying at Oxford, William Morris drew inspiration from Ruskin's works on Gothic architecture and his criticism of the inhumanity of industrialization, and from Thomas Mallory's medieval romance La Mort d'Arthur. So together with the Pre-Raphaelite painters, he started a battle against the age he was living in. He set up a firm to produce craft-made furniture, wallpaper, and other decorative objects as a reaction to utilitarian mass-produced goods. In 1883, he became a militant in the Social Democratic Federation. The 1880s saw the rise of an urbanized political left after the foundation of the Fabian Society in 1884. It was a middle-class socialist group whose members aimed at transforming Britain into a socialist state, not through revolution as Marx advised, but by systematic progressive reforms. In its early members included the Sidney and Beatrice Webb and George Bernard Shaw. The Independent Labour Party was set up in 1893, and it was a non-Marxist socialist party which attracted both male and female intellectuals. Various socialist groups were joined by young skilled workers and intellectuals who read John Ruskin's criticism of the greed, competition, and ugliness of industrial society. In the late 19th century, expressions of civic pride and national fervor were frequent among the British. Patriotism was deeply influenced by the ideas of racial superiority. Towards the end of Victoria's reign, the British considered themselves the leaders of European civilization. There was a belief that the races of the world were divided by fundamental physical and intellectual differences, that some were destined to be led by others. It was thus an obligation imposed by God on the British to spread their superior way of life, their institutions, law, and political system on native peoples throughout the world. This attitude came to be known as jingoism. Colonial power and economic progress made for the optimistic outlook of many Victorians.